welcome you here and welcome Nick Walters, who's a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. He's doing his PhD on music from the early 16th century with a particular reference to Robert Fairfax, and that's what we're going to be hearing about today with some musical examples from singers from CEMC. So over to Nick. Thanks very much.
This work would have been sung as the Mass for the feast of St. Alban, the first British martyr, celebrated in the church calendar on the 22nd of June. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about Fairfax, a bit about this composition of his, and we're going to pick apart what we just sang and explore how it was put together compositionally. So Fairfax's name was a very important one in the first 2 decades of the 16th century in England. He was highly valued and highly paid by Henry VII and Henry VIII as a composer and a singer in the Chapel Royal. He's buried with his wife Agnes in St. Albans Cathedral near the altar, meaning he must have had significant associations there, and of course he wrote music to St. Alban. The words of the Latin Mass, the words of Fairfax's composition, would have been sung every single day and were possibly better known than any other sacred text. But in order to connect these words to the Feast of St. Alban, Fairfax chose for his Mass a musical foundation, the plain chant melody Albanus Domini Laudans, which itself is also meant to be sung on the 22nd of June for the Feast of St. Alban. Or, more specifically, he chose a 9-note excerpt from it, the bit setting the Latin name of the saint, which sounds like this. Albanus. This melody is a snippet from the great plain chant tradition, plain chant, Gregorian chant, which made up the vast majority of the repertoire sung by singers of the time in church. Music consisting of just a single melodic line, referred to as monophony, unlike the excerpt we just sang, which consists of multiple melodic lines happening simultaneously, referred to as polyphony. Polyphony was sung only for special occasions. It was meant to adorn the most important parts of the liturgy and to stir devotion. It was not an everyday thing, not necessarily, and this St. Alban Mass, for example, would only have been sung on the Feast of St. Alban once a year. And compositionally, what composers of this time did with plain chant melodies was they would essentially stretch them out into very, very long note values, and they would use the stretched versions of the melodies as the musical foundation for a passage of polyphony. They'd lay it down in one of the voices, usually the tenor, and write the other voices around it. And when a pre-existing melody is used in polyphony in this way, it becomes known as a Cantus Firmus, or fixed melody. This essentially clothes the polyphony in the associations of that melody, which in this case is St. Alban. And compositionally, around the structural Cantus Firmus, it takes a lot of skill to write polyphony that's interesting and engaging, as Fairfax does. And what Fairfax is doing by writing polyphony around this Cantus Firmus, ultimately, is decorating and adorning the Albanus melody in order to celebrate St. Alban on his feast day. But in a broader context, he's decorating and adorning the plain chant tradition. And he's preserving it by using it in composition and clothing it in polyphony. Now, this particular work by Fairfax is interesting because Fairfax plays around with how he presents the simple excerpt, the Albanus melody that you just heard. In the passage we sang at the beginning, that melody is actually presented backwards, what at the time was known as temporal arcis, or in modern retrograde. And in other passages in the Mass, it's presented upside down and upside down backwards. So before he wrote his Polyphony, Fairfax planned out in detail where and how the melody was going to appear. The underlying structure of the passage we sang is carefully planned and is part of a much larger scheme. So what we're going to do now is we're going to build up this passage voice by voice from the Cantus Firmus. And what this allows us to do is not only show how the passage is pieced together compositionally and how each voice is written according to the Albanus melody, but also show how as performers we can actually take our expressive cues from the melody. So first we'll hear the Albanus melody backwards and really stretched out, sung by me, accompanied by Edward who's singing the lowest part, the basses. And you can see that these two voices form what's basically the backbone and the harmonic structure, the basic harmonic structure of the passage, the logic of harmony in another sense, and what chords you're going to hear. And all of that is based around the Albanus melody that forms the foundation. And the basses is written against that. So we'll just do that real quick. Referred to the structural Cantus Firmus, the part I was singing, as the brain of a polyphonic composition, which makes a lot of sense when you think about your considerations as a composer. If you lay the melody down with fixed rhythms, then all the other parts around it have to be written according to where that melody travels, informing what harmonies you're able to write. You may notice that in the part I was singing, some of my notes are very, very long. This is common for the time period. I'm basically, as I said, singing the Albanus melody in slow motion. And notice as we keep adding voices to this texture that most other voices have quicker and more interesting rhythms than my part. My part is essentially going to eventually get buried and camouflaged by the others. So now we'll add the next voice up, the contratenor, and this part adds a bit more interest to the polyphony. And as we're singing, pay attention to the moments where I'm singing a very long note, but then I finally change to a new note. Notice how the three of us are able to use these moments for our coordination as performers and to inform the expressive direction of our singing, sort of as we're able to build toward whenever I sing a new note. So now we'll do fastest one. As I mentioned, I'm singing the Albanus melody in slow motion. We get the sense that with the other parts, Fairfax writes their rhythms often to anticipate the arrival of a new note in my part. And for me individually, this is rather helpful because my notes are so long. So it makes it easier for me to know where things are going, and in turn it makes it easier for everyone else to know where things are going expressively in the passage and to have a direction to the lines, especially to my line, rather than it just being sort of something boring and really long in the background. Now this is something we can see much more clearly if we add the uppermost two voices. In a moment we'll sing the passage with all 5 parts. As we sing the passage through fully with all 5, listen carefully again for the moments when a new note comes along in my part, and notice that sometimes in Edward's part or in Emma's part, there are these little rhythmic figures that anticipate and lead into those moments of change. Certain voices will get basically a bit rhythmically excited as they approach the new Cantus Firmus notes, or just after those notes arrive. And from this we can conclude that Fairfax expressively shapes his polyphony around the Cantus Firmus. It's something basically written into the music. And it's something that we can use as performers as well. It gives us specific places to lead toward expressively and dynamically. Now with all 5 parts, my part is basically hidden within the denseness of the texture. It's basically camouflaged by the other voices. But the melodies around it are written and shaped according to it. It's basically like the ghost of the Albanus melody is there, but it's influencing everything else that you hear. So now we'll sing the passage through all 5 parts. So the Albanus melody truly is the brain of the passage in several senses. It's not only the structural musical foundation for the passage, and for many passages in the St. Alban Mass by Fairfax, and it's not only what ties this particular piece of sacred music to a particular occasion in the church calendar, which at the most basic level is what a Cantus Firmus does, but it's also what shapes the music, and we get a sense of the most tremendous respect and reverence for the great plain chant tradition in polyphony like this. It's not just that the composer sort of plops the melody down because it's tied in a particular feast day, but the entire passage, every step, every leap, every rhythmic figure takes its cues from Albanus and its backwards iteration here. One way I like to think about it is if the Albanus melody is sort of like a skeleton or maybe the form of a body, the other voices added to it clothe the body in rich harmony, and all the rhythmic activity and direction in those voices animate the body, whereby it appears to behave sort of like a living and breathing organism. Now, I hope this has been a useful and interesting demonstration of how the plain chant tradition is preserved, not only in daily singing, but within the polyphony, meant to decorate the liturgy and its important feast days. Also how the plain chant generates the polyphony and infuses it with its associated meanings. And although the words we're singing are from the Latin Mass, which would have been sung every single day, the Albanus melody running through the texture infuses the music with its associations, which the Feast of St. Alban is in just a few weeks actually, so we're not too far off. So thank you very much for attending today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Any direct questions immediately for Nick? I'm sure there's lots of interesting stuff going around.
Can you just help me understand the backwards part?
The backwards, yes. So the Albanus melody that I was saying at the beginning, it's very short, it's just 9 notes. And it's not a particularly interesting melody, so what Fairfax did to make things more interesting for himself and for the music was, in all of the various places across the large composition that it appears, he said, I'm going to make this a lot more interesting, so I'll present it in its original form, I'll flip it around and write it backwards, I'll write it upside down, so like inverting the pitches, and then I'll invert them and write them backwards at the same time.
I'd love to ask a question about performance practice, actually, and kind of historically informed performance. And my question is, obviously, in later music, we are aware of kind of word painting. I know this is something that you're interested in, which is why I'm asking. With regard to setting text and painting text, as it were. I also noticed when you guys were singing that there are certain things which you do as performers naturally, which are not written, as it were, in a score from this period, but that we do anyway. And I'm talking about things like growing through notes towards a certain note, which I think ties in with your structural Cantus Firmus point that you were making. Do you know of any kind of reasoning for that performance practice, or is there a reason why we kind of sing Patris or anything like that? The reason why we go towards those kind of notes naturally, because there's nothing telling us that we should do that as performance, and yet everybody automatically does. So I'm just interested as to if you have any thoughts on that, as to whether it's maybe a structural thing, or if you can feel that as a performer, basically, and hence it kind of defines.
Well, I think with just how this particular kind of music is built, I think it has a lot to do with the alternation between stasis and then movement. And I think you get this kind of rhythmic ebb and flow throughout the passage. You have some moments which are a little bit sort of more reposed, and then other moments where there's an awful lot happening. And I think, as I said, all of that is a lot of it is tied to the Cantus Firmus melody. So I think it's kind of, as performers, we naturally want to create some kind of musical arc for where we're kind of traveling expressively. But I would say I think it has to do with that stasis. Now, do you mean particularly tied to the text as well?
Well, in this particular context, it was to do with the Cantus Firmus, because I noticed that it always happens at a point at which you're about to move, for example.
Yes.
So it is certainly related, but I'm also aware that, aside from the fact that they can see the other notes going on, that actually the other performers can hear the rate of movement and know where it's going as well, and therefore also go with you in a sense. So that stasis and movement thing is a really fundamental part of, I think, your argument with regards to the Cantus Firmus being the structural foundation, which actually it does fade into the background, and yet it still informs without it, almost subliminally in that sense.
Yeah, because you can't really, if at the time you knew the Albanus melody, you probably wouldn't be able to tell what the passage is based on it.
Yeah.
But it's still there. It's still informing everything.
Yeah. There is another question here.
Yes, thank you for that. That was really lovely. What's your future ambition? Where are you taking your talents? What are you going to do? What to do?
So I'm currently in the third year of my PhD, and I'm writing a lot about this particular kind of repertoire. So really early 16th century. And I suppose I'm just hoping to take the research as far as I can, just continue with it, and continue performing the music as well. Hopefully making it even more widely known, and working to understand it better as well, from a sort of analysis point of view. But yeah, so I suppose both scholarship and performance just continue that.
And do you play any early instruments? Or is your voice your instrument?
Just voice. I play piano as well, but no other instruments.
Incredibly beautiful. Is there any chance you could just sing it so we can take it home with us?
Oh, sure.
You will also have, just so you're aware as well, that the workshops are recorded, so they will be on YouTube, so there is a facility to look back and experience it again when you do get home. But I will allow that. There's nothing beats the live.
It's just one bit, very near the end of this passage, where there's a long held B in your passage, the penultimate. Just to demonstrate how much you can do with one single Cantus Firmus note. So you sing your B, So I won't use it. So I'm going against that. La 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 la. And then just put all the other parts on top. So even though it's just one note, there's so much, richness and variety, potential in that. Let's just try that. That feels incredibly dynamic, doesn't it? Even though that it's extremely static in this one part. So that's one of the great, well, as you said, this is one of the great skills of
Otherwise, Helen, what's next?
So next week we have another kind of little mini lecture by Amy, who's a second year music student, on the use of printed part books in performance in 16th century musicals. Please do come along.
That's 100 years later, so a different form.